Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, literary aviatrix, and I'm back with another episode of Aviatrix Classics with my co-hosts, Dr. Jacque Boyd and Captain Jenny Beatty. And today we're going to discuss Alone in the Sky by Jean Batten. Fewer than 10% of pilots and aircraft mechanics are women. These are their stories of tenacity, adventure, and courage. Stories with the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Welcome to the literary aviatrix community, where we leverage the power of story to build and celebrate our community and inspire the next generation of aviation. Jacque and Jenny, welcome back.
Hello.
Oh my gosh, here we go. So we've jumped ahead in time, which I'll be honest, I didn't actually do the mental math on that. We've been kind of in the early aviators in the teens, 19 teens and 20s, and we've kind of jumped ahead to the 1930s because I was eager to get the perspective of somebody overseas. So we may have to talk about, I definitely feel like there's a lot more material to cover in that earlier period, but here we are with Jean Batten, our lady from New Zealand, with her 1979 version of Alone in the Sky. And so, Jenny, I know you always come prepared to talk about sort of the evolution of the books. What do you have for us on Jean?
Hi. Yes. Well, Jean Batten, as you're going to hear, incredibly talented pilot who set many world records. And the first book she wrote about her first record-breaking flight is called Solo Flight. And it was printed in or published in 1934, and it's about her very first record-breaking flight from England to Australia. So it does not include anything about all of her later achievements, which were considerable. Then she wrote My Life, and this book was published in 1938, and this book does talk about all of her record-breaking flights in detail and all of her honors and awards and things she did. So published in 1938, after she pretty much had accomplished all of her aviation achievements. Then the book that we're discussing today, Alone in the Sky, it is basically a not reprinting, it's a republishing, revised edition of her 1938 memoir, My Life, with updating, some light editing, and some additions. So when you read this book, you're pretty much getting the same thing as her 1938 book, My Life. The other book I'm just going to mention briefly right now and probably discuss a little bit more later. This is a biography of Jean Batten and her life, written by Ian McCursey, and this was published in 1990. Pretty comprehensive biography. So those are the books. Oh, and I forgot to mention, then this book that we're discussing today, Alone in the Sky, this is available on the internet, used for as low as $4. And I have found autographed editions, first edition signed, for about $33 to $50. So pretty accessible, and maybe obviously accessible in libraries as well.
Yeah, and I was able to find mine used. It is not signed for a very reasonable price, so nothing spectacular there. So I was grateful for that, and it has its dust cover and everything, so good to go. And so, Jacque, we've appointed you our expert in, the impact of our characters that we're reading about. What do you have to say about Jean?
I was amazed at the compressed time frame that all this happened in, and the time frame of the world. I had to keep bringing myself back to where she was and cut out a lot of the extraneous information about what else was happening in the world in the 30s and the late 30s when she finished all this work. So it just is, it reads a bit like a travel dialogue, and a lot of parties, a lot of celebrations for her achievements. It's very much also a look at the social network of the time. And it was a fascinating slice of time. And I agree, looking at what was happening in the 30s, we kind of did this mental jump with the other women pilots that we've looked at. And when in one place she said she was looking forward to meeting Amelia Earhart because they had been joint winners of the Harmon
Right.
Trophy. And then but she passed a couple of months later. And so there's all this mixing of time that we've talked about. And taking a look at it in the 30s was kind of a mental jump.
I
But
agree. I had to recage myself too. Yeah.
and one of the things that stuck out for me during the whole book, and it's something that I've had to consider with the early women pilots, was social status and where the money came from for them to do what it was they did. And
Yep.
she financed the majority of her record breaking trips, which really was stunning because so many of the others had had sponsors, either aircraft companies or relatively wealthy people in their lives. That caught my attention during the whole book.
Charles Lindbergh had sponsorship.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then prize money. Yeah. No, I agree. I noted that as well. And I also saw this kind of as a travelogue. In fact, like a lot of it kind of read like almost an Outside Magazine article or a National Geographic. I found myself Googling locations the entire time. You know, some of these places I've been to, many I have not, and just trying to put myself mentally in the setting of the time with this woman who was doing these things. So for me, like the overview, I think that the title of this book, it's a much better title than the previous one, the My Life one. Alone in the Sky is so apt for this because she talks about her feelings of loneliness, and I felt her loneliness. I cannot imagine these long distance. I mean, just for your frame of reference, in my aviation career, I've flown alone in an aircraft maybe for a total of 5 hours. Like I was in dual piloted aircraft, and a single pilot flight in the helicopter that I was flying involved at least a flight mechanic in the back. So yes, I was out over the water, 70 miles offshore, single pilot, but I at least had somebody in the back to talk to, and I had radios. And she had none of that. She was completely alone in the sky. So this was a really remarkable story, a lot of detail. I think it would appeal to people who are, kind of interested, in aviation history, as always, be interested in, what was the world like? What is it like to travel the world? Almost like a real explorer, I feel like. And then, there are a lot of details about aviation, like very specific stuff that I think, and about flying, that I think would be of interest in some lessons for pilots that are universal. So lots of that. And Jenny, did you have any kind of overarching feelings about the book that you wanted to talk to before we get into it?
Yeah, I was very impressed at her memory or her note taking or both. I certainly don't have a memory that can recall really, really specific details about lengthy flights, when she saw this or when this happened, what was going on in the flight at that moment, in that place where she was. And I'm talking on flights that were 9, 12, 13 hours long.
Right.
And that she stopped, she was drinking, trying to pour tea, or she ate an orange and felt better. And all those details, really, really detailed information is in there about all of her activities. So I was very impressed by that. And she mentions a lot of names, including many early aviators and what they had accomplished, and how she set herself to try to beat their records, but also honoring their accomplishments, and many aviators who helped her. And then very, very lengthy lists of dignitaries, wealthy people, VIP people, royalty, who she met, presidents of aero clubs, presidents of nations, a very long list, and what she ate and what she wore, and a lot of detail in this book. And I will say more about than what is not mentioned in the book maybe later, because if you think about that barrage of detail, there's some things that are absent that you only notice the absence later, maybe after closing the covers of the book.
That's interesting.
Very
And and some of that detail too was reminiscent in my mind of a book that we discussed in the Aviatrix book club, 38 Charlie, right, by Jerry Mock. And when we read that, I felt like it read, and she did her solo flight around the world, I think in the 1950s. I want to say 1954, 60s, somewhere in there.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, later. But her book, when you read it, it's kind of like almost has the aviation appeal for sure. And if in fact it was one of the most celebrated and complimented books of all of the books we've read in the book club so far. And the reason we discussed it is because I had access to the lady who has republished it, Wendy Hollinger, and then Shasta Ways, who was mentored by her for her solo flight. So that's the only book I've done in the book club where the author's no longer with us, but it read like a housekeeping magazine article too, because she really wrote it to also appeal to like the lady readers of the time, I thought. And then of course her nickname was the Flying Housewife. So I found a lot of parallels between that book and this one. And I just wanted to also mention that Jean Batten was the inspiration for a gorgeous, sweeping novel published recently, Great Circle, by Maggie Shipstead. And Maggie, in my interview with her, talks about seeing the statue of Jean in New Zealand, and that being the spark that inspired. Oh, and Jenny is holding up a picture of that statue, which is at the airport in Auckland, I guess. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. And my sister, who lives in Australia and visited New Zealand, sent me this photo explicitly. Yes, it's at the Auckland International Airport. And in the statue, it's one of the photographs in the books. She's wearing an overcoat holding flowers, and it's after her triumphant flight to New Zealand, which we'll talk about.
Yep. We will talk more about that. And I'm going to refer back to that later with a quote toward the end of the book. So let's get into it now. In this book, we get a quick image. I'll just give kind of an overview. We get a quick picture of what life was like for her in New Zealand, growing up in New Zealand. And it was, Jackie will say more about this, but really around, she was kind of coming of age, I think, around World War I, and watching, the men in her community go off to war and then come back. And then I was kind of surprised, actually. I expected sort of that formative diatribe to kind of go on longer in the book and have us lead into aviation a little more gently, but we roll right into her flight from London to Australia, her first record setting flight from London to Australia. And then we get into the London to South America trip, which I thought was fascinating and I actually didn't know anything about. And then she does another, her big dream was to do a flight from London to New Zealand, and she was able to accomplish that. And then she ends the book on another record-setting flight from Australia to London. And so that's kind of how we're going to break down this book and kind of talk about it. So Jackie, uh, tell us a little bit about Jean as a child.
I too was a little surprised at the length of that first chapter called Early Life. It's only 6, 7 pages long, and it covers a longer period of time, not just as a child. But she was born in 1909 in Rotorua, New Zealand, and I loved the second paragraph where she said, "It was therefore not surprising that even at an early age of 2, I had developed a great desire to roam." And I thought, what a wonderful way to put who you are as a person who loves that discovery. And the the secondary thought on her roaming was that it was alone. It was by herself. And it was that I think I'm filing away as a descriptor for someone who is independent and inquisitive. So it goes on to talk about her parents a little bit. Her dad joined the army, and what was the Territorial Army in New Zealand when World War I broke out. And all the while I was thinking about my own history lessons for what we know about that period and how it was affecting people in a country so far removed from the center of the war. And when she talks about watching the men leave, it just is a really brilliant account that brought a different aspect to that period of time. She talks about her dad writing letters back to the family, and she got one from him that had violets in it. He had picked flowers for her off basically the battlefield, and that was in a letter for her. So that period of time was, she didn't go into great depth, but there was enough on the surface that made me want to go back and see, particularly the biography, if there was more information, because there's a lot of formative work there for what she does later. And she went to a boarding school that she talks about, which is very indicative of the kind of social status they must have held, whether it was financial or not. Being able to go to a boarding school and having that kind of influence in her life. So it's very brief, but it lays a tremendous background for the rest of the book.
I think one of the things that struck me as I got into this book was that she was really adept at her descriptions. And the things that she described from growing up in New Zealand were the kinds of things that were, it just was almost otherworldly. You know, she describes um, the nature, the natural geysers, mineral springs, mud spots, thermal activity. And then she lives near a town that's filled with tourists, which helps instill, I think, a sense of wanderlust. She has this infusion of the rest of the world from her father going off to war, but also from the tourists who come to her local town. So she has, where some kids might grow up and just be sort of focused on their own environs, she has access at least to understand that there's a big world out there. And it's out there for her to see. Jenny, did you have anything to say about her early years?
No, I really have nothing more to add.
Okay, so then she finishes this kind of summary of her childhood, and she goes. She, well, are you done talking? Because you had more to talk about.
Do you want me to go on to the second chapter?
Yes. Sorry, because I just looked at my notes. I was like, "There's so much more."
Well, this is when she went to visit England with her mother in 1929. And so keeping in mind that time frame with everything, she had there Charles Kingsford Smith had done his flew from the Pacific to the Americas to Australia, and so she's interested in aviation. She doesn't quite know how she's going to get there, but she became quite an accomplished pianist. And so her solution to finding the money to fly was to sell her piano, which just sent her family into a tailspin, literally. And so that kind of opened up that area for her when she was in England with her mother. And I think one of the things that this brought home for me we're looking at a pilot not from the United States, not from our backgrounds. And the pilots that she mentions who did the record-breaking flights at the time and who she met at the Aero Clubs in London, all British pilots. And it's one of those that I think will cause people to do a little bit of research on their own.
Yeah.
Had I not done the research that I did in the early 2000s about the American women who flew for the British ATA, I wouldn't have known a lot of the names that she brings up.
Right.
And even as someone learning to fly, when she got involved in the London Aero Club, wow, talk about a lineage of pilots who are there.
The who's who.
Yes.
Yeah, the who's who of aviation. Yeah.
De Havilland, I mean, she was in the midst of some real heavy hitters. And
Can we mention some of the women right now? Because she just lists them. Unfortunately, she doesn't talk about their personalities or accomplishments.
right.
But she mentions Lady Heath, the Duchess of Bedford, Lady Bailey, Amy Johnson, who she's considered the most famous woman in Britain for various reasons, but kind of the equivalent of Amelia Earhart in Britain. And the Honorable Mrs. Victor Bruce and Pauline Gower,
And
who I'm sure we're going to visit with later.
Winifred Spooner. There are names that this is one of those books that's, yes, a wonderful chronicle of some unbelievable accomplishments, but it's also a jumping off point for a lot of digging with other people, and simply because we're dealing here with someone who is not from our country and our history. And so it takes it to a little bit of a different level that causes some stretching And I love that.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
And
I
you know, the airplanes at the time, I think during her first record breaking attempts, you think this was an open cockpit
Yep.
biplane, and it's just astonishing. I love the description she wrote about her solo flight, when she said it was a calm evening with a little wind, and after a final 3-point landing, just as I commenced to taxi forward to the hangar, I heard Major Travers' voice on the speaking tube that was connected to the earphones in my leather helmet. "Wait a minute, Jean," he said, and started to climb out of the front cockpit. As he stepped down off the wing, I saw that he was clasping the dual control column under one arm. He held it up and said to me with a smile, "She's all yours, Jean," and then began to walk off to the clubhouse. That paragraph says so much about the hard specific flying characteristics of the time and the airplane. It absolutely was one of my favorite descriptors in the entire book.
It does place you in that moment in time, but it also is kind of universal, right? Like every civilian pilot I know, in military it's a little different, but every civilian pilot I know tells this story of how they were just flying around and their instructor hopped out and said, "It's all yours," without any warning. So
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was one of those where we're all kind of surprised, but when your instructor actually takes the dual control and
right.
yeah, but that early on in the book sort of gave a little hint to the kind of detail and descriptiveness that she used for everything. And
Right.
I agree with what Jenny said at first. I'd like to go back and read the original book to see if there's any mention of, did she keep journals? Did she keep a written log of everything else, not just the flying? Because this is just extraordinarily detailed.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if she had a notepad while she was flying and was
Yeah,
just writing, but
yeah.
she never mentions it.
Well, later she does mention keeping a log, which pilots do on cross
Right.
country
A
flights.
log is what? What does that? I was a log keeper on a ship. I had to
Yeah.
write everything down.
Yeah.
That's different than my pilot's logbook, you know?
Well, no, I mean, I think it was a log, but it
Yeah.
was a cross country log of, at this time, I'm over this checkpoint kind of
Right.
thing. And I spotted this landmark and it's this time and I'm at this altitude. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
She did keep that. Yeah. She
Yeah.
does mention that.
Well, she'd have
Later.
to for the detail that we're talking about here for sure.
Right. Right.
But
So anything.
in this chapter, she talks a lot about the background with her flying, how she was earning her hours, what she was doing to earn her certificates. And she had started to plan a solo flight to Australia at this time and found someone who was interested in helping finance that. And so it goes on. She says, after months of preparation and organization, I took off for Australia in April of 1933. Well, this first trip had the weather descriptions just sent chills. I remember the first storm I ever got in an airplane that wasn't an open cockpit, had a radio, and I cannot imagine what went through her mind with this. And so she she didn't make it. She made it as far as India, but then turned back.
Which, by the way, is really far.
Yes, it is.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So it was a precursor to a lot of the rest of the book. It laid a tremendously good foundation for what was to come.
That's right. And what comes next is her successful trip from London. She launches on this trip again. And what I found really fun, just personally, is that, I spent 30 days in Europe this past summer, and I went to some places that I probably wouldn't have gone to, except for I worked as a diplomat in a US embassy with other people who had dispersed to various places. So I got to go to some unusual places, I think, for tourists when I did this tour. And so I kind of followed along with her. She flies south to Italy. She goes east over the Gulf of Corinth, and I spent a couple of days on the beach in the Gulf of Corinth, and then over to Greece, to Tatoi, near Athens. And then she goes on to Nicosia, Cyprus, and that was another place I got to go. So I felt like, it was really fun. It's really fun to read about the places you haven't been, and then it's really fun to kind of imagine having been in that location and thinking about her flying over. And then I fall off the trail as she continues east into Asia. She flies down the coast of Burma to Singapore, and she encounters the monsoons and flies almost blind, thoroughly drenched, as you were talking about. That was one of the things that really struck me. This woman is completely exposed to the weather. And I'm like, no, thank you. I just cannot imagine doing that. Give me an open cockpit plane on a sunny, clear day. And it needs to be relatively warm for me. But the things that she went through in this open biplane.
Wait, this is the Gypsy Moth an open cockpit?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It was. Okay.
Oh,
I
yeah.
missed that. Okay.
Absolutely. Yep. And then she continues southeast through Indonesia, and she describes one of the things that I loved is when she kind of describes the things that she sees below, like the jungle, the birds, the crocodiles, those kinds of things on her journeys. Because I have some of those memories too from my own flying. I got to see some really neat things from the air, and it just gives you a perspective. It helps people who don't fly, and particularly people who didn't fly at the time, gives them a little perspective on, what you actually get to see when you're flying around like that. And then there's one particular scene that my jaw was just on the floor reading the entire thing, and I'm just going to go through it. So she's in Batavia, which is in Indonesia, and she's spent the night there, and she's ready to take off to continue her flight. And she says, when we arrived at the aerodrome next morning, it was to find a thick layer of fog covering the ground. I despaired of being able to take off until the sun had dispersed the fog later in the morning. Mr. Smet, however, declared that although it was so dense, the fog was not very thick through. I'm not exactly sure what that means. And he says, I shall drive my car at full speed up and down a section several times and clear a pathway through the fog. Then, if you're quick, you can take off down the path before the sides close together. The scene assumed an air of unreality. There we were standing beside the airplane, which looked ghostly in the poor light, and hardly able to see each other when wisps of fog drifted across the vision like smoke. There we were, talking about clearing a pathway through the fog. Alice in Wonderland would not have been more surprised at the idea than I. Mr. Smet, who was most enthusiastic, however, and eager to try his scheme, drove the car alongside my airplane. I shook hands with him, and climbing into the cockpit, ran up the engine. Arranging everything for the takeoff and strapping myself as securely as I could, I called to him that all was ready. The fog was so thick that I could only just distinguish the dark blur of Mr. Smet's car as it raced forward and disappeared into the fog. I had visions of Mr. Smet driving blindly along at full speed, becoming lost somewhere in the middle of the aerodrome. But suddenly the car reappeared, turned, and raced back again. It seemed hopeless, and yet, after many similar dashes, the fog thinned out in the path of the car and gradually began to look as if someone had sliced it with a knife. The effect was really extraordinary, with the high walls of fog on each side, and it reminded me of a biblical picture I had seen as a child depicting the crossing of the Red Sea. Mr. Smet shouted to me to get ready as he made a final dash down the rift he had cleared. Although he had insisted that the fog did not extend up to any appreciable height, it was with a certain amount of misgiving that I pushed the throttle level forward and guided the airplane through the rift. Just as I neared the end of the pathway, the machine left the ground and the walls closed together. The fog enveloped everything in a dense whiteness. Climbing the machine gently, for there was a heavy load of petrol aboard, I wished desperately that I had not attempted to take off. Suddenly, I was almost blinded by a strong glare as the machine penetrated the fog layers and emerged into the brilliant sunlight and blue sky. Beneath me stretched the white carpet of fog, completely covering the ground. And knowing that Mr. Smet would hear the roar of my engine and realize all was well, I set a course for Surabaya. Listen, I've flown in a lot of fog. I was stationed in San Francisco, I was stationed in Los Angeles, and we had special rules for 00 because it's the Coast Guard and we go out in things. We had very special rules that allowed us to take off in zero visibility, but we had to have a good reason for it. And so I've seen the fog layers, and I just thought this was ingenious. Let's drive a car down the runway and see if we could break this thing up. Like, that's kind of a cool tool to have in your pocket, especially as a Coast Guard pilot.
Right.
Wish I'd had that. So anyway,
so fog does rely on the stillness of the air, and that's why, like orange groves, they sometimes have big fans to disperse
keep pushing
the freezing fog.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was brilliant. I was like, and like she said, just unreal. Right. So she continues down, and she makes it to Australia. Like I can't remember. She set a record for, it was a women's record. Is that right on this one? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think so.
Yeah. So solo to Australia. She was the first woman to do that.
She was, I think Amy Johnson.
Yeah, you're right.
Had done it. And she was breaking.
I'm checking my notes.
She was breaking the time record, I believe.
Okay,
so we're flight to Australia. Hang on, because well, one note I have is that her cruising speed is 80 miles an hour. So picture that.
Yep. Gypsy moth.
Hang on. Okay, here we go. Upon her arrival in Darwin, Australia, which is on the side of Australia that's closest to England, just
the west. Yeah.
So she's just reached Australia and hasn't crossed the continent yet. She says she's pleased to have beaten Amy Johnson's record by 4 days.
Right.
There you go. That was
but she still faces 2,200 miles over the continent of Sydney.
That says a lot. Yeah. But it was. Amy Johnson had done it, and she was breaking the time record.
That's right.
On it.
Yeah, I had to check my notes. Yeah.
Thank you, Jenny, for I didn't make a note of that. So thank you so much. So so she arrives in Australia. She is warmly welcomed there. Then they pack up her plane and she rides a boat with her aircraft over to New Zealand, and then she does a speaking tour of New Zealand in the plane, and she's invited to do she's one of the things she talks about a lot is kind of her presence on the radio, which is really cool, thinking about how many people she was reaching in the imaginations of the listening public at the time. She gets invited after this New Zealand tour to go back to Australia and be the announcer for an air race from England to Australia. So after she finishes commentating on this race, she plans a trip to go back to England. She wants to go back for the Royal Jubilee. And at some point, so here's a little personal detail on her, and it's like almost the only hint of her personal life that we get in this book, which is she sees a headline announcing that she might be getting engaged. Well, meanwhile, she reveals to us, the readers, in this moment, at nowhere else in the book does she mention it, that she had been proposed to, and that she had written this guy in England to tell him, no thanks, I'm going to focus on my flying. I'm not ready to get married. And so he hadn't gotten the message yet, and apparently granted an interview to somebody in England. And now this is in the newspapers in New Zealand. And it's like all she says about it. There's nothing else. She's like, no, I'm not getting married right now. Sorry, he didn't get the memo, in time, but that's not going to happen.
It was such an isolated comment about a big change in life or possible, and then nothing. Zippo
Yeah.
in the rest of the book.
Which for me, and I know Jenny's going to get into this a little bit later, but which for me reveals a lot because it tells me there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're not going to find out about Jean in this book. Okay,
Correct.
cool. This is about her flying period. That's it.
Right.
Yep. It also makes me want to know more about her and the story behind that. So, she starts this return flight because Jenny's going to take over here in a minute when she's back in London and is doing her trip to South America. But on this trip back, she gets her engine overhauled. The Moth's engine is overhauled. She starts her trip back to England, to London. And her engine fails she's flying along at 6,000 feet over the water, and she nearly goes in the drink. So I just want to read this passage because this is another one that resonates with me, having flown a lot over the ocean and just thinking about being in her position. And this is in chapter 7. She says, so that I might fly in clearer atmosphere and also take full advantage of the following wind, I climbed up to 6,000 feet and set off across the Timor Sea for the island of Timor. Below me floated a cloud carpet tinted orange by the dust, and occasionally through a gap I would glimpse the sea. About 250 miles from land, the engine suddenly gave a cough. Were my ears deceiving me? I listened intently. There it was again, a sudden falter which seemed to shake the entire structure of the machine. The engine gave a final cough, then there was dead silence. A terrible feeling of helplessness swept over me as the airplane commenced a slow, silent glide towards the cloud carpet. Perhaps it is only a temporary petrol blockage, I thought, as my brain worked like lightning, trying to find a way out of the predicament. I gave the engine full throttle, but there was no response. There was no sound to relieve the terrible silence except the whirring noise, like a sigh, as the lifeless plane glided down. Surely this can't be the end, I thought. No, it's impossible. There must be some way out. Almost fascinated, I watched the altimeter. 5,000, 4,500, 4,000 feet. I was in the cloud layer now. It was not very thick through, and at 3,000 feet, I emerged to see the blue expanse of sea stretching into infinity. This was agonizing. I must try to land the machine on the water as best I could. Undoing my shoes and my flying suit, I reached for the small hatchet which I carried in case of emergency and placed it in the leather pocket at my side. There seemed a desperate chance that if I were able to land the machine on an even keel, I might be able to cut one wing away and float it on it. The last few minutes were torture as I neared the water. The propeller was still just ticking over, and in a last desperate effort before attempting to land, I opened and closed the throttle lever without success. Suddenly, with a noise that was nearly deafening in the stillness and like a great sob, the engine burst into life again. I sank back, greatly relieved, scarcely daring to breathe lest I should break the spell. As the engine regained its steady note, I gradually coaxed the airplane up to 6,000 feet again. For the next 3 hours, however, until I was flying once more over land, my mind was tortured with doubt. Whoo-wee!
Yeah.
Can y'all imagine? No.
The very worst possible type of emergency. She would never have been found.
No, she would have been a goner. So I feel like she has a few of these moments in the book where she kind of, luck plays a huge part. I mean, she did take action. She was at least trying things. She kept her wits about her. But I can imagine, like, in that it took probably, she's rolling along at 80 knots, and she's not falling out of the sky. She's watching the altimeter tick down and not feeling like she has anything that she can do to save the plane. So miraculous, good for her.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about this for a moment,
Yeah.
because I think this is one of the most singular characteristics of Jean Batten. She has a sang-froid, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it takes real guts to do what this woman did solo, and again and again.
Right.
And having frightening, terrifying emergencies like this one, where your engine quits, you're planning to land on water with no land in sight.
Mm-hmm.
And she keeps going, and she keeps going and doing additional record-breaking flights. Most normal people cannot do that.
No, I have friends who experienced scary stuff in the aircraft, in the Coast Guard, and that was a significant emotional event, and it messed them up. They're like, I'm good. I flew and I'm done. And I think I would have been done after that.
Right. And so I want to point out, she didn't really talk in this book and tell us about all of her training to prepare for these moments.
True.
There's one tiny little reference to how early on in the 30s, as she was working on one of her earliest licenses, she talks, I think it was when she was working on her B license, which is the commercial license, just a tiny phrase that says she studied mechanics, she studied engines, she studied aircraft. But no, she doesn't flesh that out for us to tell us about the depth of that training that I think is probably considerable. And she doesn't talk about her instrument training,
Right.
which she had to have to do all of this incredible flying, blind, they call it, on instruments. She didn't talk about that training and acquiring those skills. So she, on the one hand, is highly skilled and trained, which she doesn't talk about, but she also has a personality where she can mentally withstand these pressures and these dire emergencies, life-threatening events, because even just flying into clouds blind with terrible rain and not quite sure where you are in relation to terrain, in relation to obstacles, in relation to sea or land. And she just does it.
I know.
Most normal people can't do that.
No.
And even a lot of pilots have a lot of difficulty doing that.
Yeah.
So I just needed to point that out at this juncture, that she's really exceptional in this regard.
I agree.
And I think it relates to some of her other personality parts.
There is a risk-taking personality that's been identified in the last, probably 30 years. And I think she was very much of that ilk.
Yes.
But then...
And it's not just adrenaline junkie.
Oh, no.
No.
Adrenaline junkie kind of connotates someone who is a risk taker without planning.
Out of control.
Right.
She's not out of control.
No.
She is not out of control. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And up till now, also, I just want to point out, because we're about to get into a section I'm going to discuss. Up till now, she hasn't talked a whole lot about the incredibly meticulous planning she did to do these flights.
That's true too. Yeah.
Which she did do.
Well, of course she did. I mean, she just kind of
you don't just magically show up in, Timbuktu and there's fuel for you.
Right. That's what I was gonna say. Like she's dropping all these obscure names of geographic locations I've never even heard of.
Right.
And I'm like, how did she know to go there? Well, she must have done a lot of planning to
Right.
figure out to go there.
And
And then
that
she
was,
does.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say she does start talking about it later, but up until this
So
point,
far she hasn't.
That was one of the huge missing links for me with this. She didn't talk about that.
Right.
And later on in the flight to New Zealand, she mentions having to have bought a credit kind of thing for fuel so that she wouldn't have to spend cash. All that planning had to go on for every one of these trips.
Right.
But we don't
months
hear
of planning.
that point of it.
And I do want to mention one more thing about these flights that she made. Well, this flight that she made to Australia and back, and then later New Zealand and back, which we'll discuss later. Many of these places she landed, they're part of the British Empire.
Oh,
right.
Absolutely.
So she had
the British, the Dutch, the French. Yeah, she's
allies.
going. Yeah, she's going to the colonies. Yeah. So that's
Well,
that's a great point.
That goes back to my original comment about wrapping our mind around the time frame and
correct.
what was going on in the world that she mentions obtusely and that she doesn't mention. So,
well, again, it's the water you live in as a fish. So why would you mention it? It's only really different now from our perspective, almost 100 years later, right? 90 years later.
Yeah. No, that's true too. Yeah. So this engine failure over the water was just like gut wrenching for me as a former Coast Guard pilot. Looking at this, I was like, this is the thing that we trained for. But we had radios and EPIRBs and stuff like that. And she's got nothing. She's
ELTs.
alone and unafraid out there. So but this engine failure, she's having these engine hiccups. The rest of the route, she loses an engine again over France and is going down, into the fields, but is able to pull it out there. And she limps along to England and gets there in time for the Jubilee and all the parties. And while she's there, she gets an upgrade. So she sells the Moth and she buys a Percival Gull monoplane with a covered cockpit this time. And she starts planning this trip to South America, which is where Jenny takes over.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk for a moment about that airplane because it is so different, quite an upgrade from the Moth. So like you said, a monoplane, but also an enclosed cockpit. But it also has what she calls a petrol pump, where before she was during her long cross-country flights previously in the Gypsy Moth, she was having to hand pump to transfer fuel from some of the auxiliary tanks into the tank that fed the engine, and then it had a gravity feed of fuel into the engine. Right. This one has a fuel pump. It also has hydraulic brakes, flaps, a metal propeller. She decides to skip the starter, so it's still going to be hand propped. Later, much later for a later trip, she does add an electric starter, but here she does not have it. And she talks about the cost and says that it claims that she spent every penny on it, adding the aux fuel tanks and some other things.
Yeah.
And it cruises at almost double the other speed of the other aircraft, about 150 miles an hour, which is significant.
And didn't you love her comment that was rather futuristic about why she did the monoplane? Because it was going to be the leading edge of aviation to have just a monoplane. I loved that foresight.
She was right. Yeah.
And she also mentions how there were a lot of naysayers to that in that context. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that this section that I've just talked about, this flight to Australia, the first one in the Moth, while I was kind of like jarred by it being early in the book, it actually really gave us a sense of a frame of reference because we get to take that trip again with her in the monoplane, and it's very different. All right.
So the next few chapters, I'm going to be talking about chapters 8 through 13. And this is where she talks about her record-breaking flight from England to South America. And it really was a tremendous trip. She actually says that she'd already been plotting this trip. In fact, I don't know if you guys mentioned it, but her original, when she first learned to fly, she knew she wanted to fly from England to New Zealand. So that comes up later.
Yeah.
But very early on, she also set her flights on this flight to fly to South America. And here is where, for the first time, it actually begins in chapter 7, where she talks about the months of preparation for this flight, closely studying the South Atlantic weather, which is significant, which we will hear, but also all the permissions, multiple permissions from different nations that she is going to be stopping at for fuel and before moving on. And so this is the first mention of that kind of preparation, which she just omitted it previously. Okay, so in chapter 8, I want to mention that she set her sights on this because no woman had flown across the South Atlantic solo.
Mm-hmm.
As a reminder, that we're now in the time frame of 1935.
Mm-hmm.
Amelia Earhart had crossed the North Atlantic solo in 1932. Beryl Markham, who was from Kenya, later flew solo the opposite direction from east to west over the North Atlantic. She did that in 1936. That hasn't occurred yet at this time.
This is a really important point because I frequently call her or have called her the first woman to fly from east to west. And now I stand corrected and I won't make that mistake anymore.
Well, and I think that points out, so you're not alone in this, Liz, but how we, North Americans and Europeans, have a Northern Hemisphere perspective.
Yep, that's
Very
fair.
true.
And we're all guilty of it who
Yeah.
live in this hemisphere, so we're a little myopic about this. Yeah. And also, I mean, Africa and South America, especially at that time, were considered, well, I won't use the pejoratives, but they were not considered developed at that time. And
Right.
so there was just much less of a baseline already of aviation.
Right.
Not that there were not aviators, there certainly were. And there were others who had crossed the South Atlantic, but just this particular achievement had not occurred.
Yeah.
So it took a lot of planning. And again, she studied a lot of the weather, which again came from, apparently some of the traffic across the South Atlantic were in Zeppelins. Okay. And flying boats. So her doing it in a tiny single engine monoplane, it's pretty significant.
Yeah.
So she left England in November 1935, flew over 9 hours straight to Casablanca. And there, I guess I can read it. This quote about she made all these arrangements and then she discovers that maybe she's missing one that might jeopardize the entire trip. But so she lands in Casablanca, and as she's finishing the meal, a health officer wanted to know if I'd been vaccinated. Giving myself a mental pat on the back for my careful organization, I searched through my papers until I came to a medical certificate attesting that I had been vaccinated for smallpox. No, that would not do, it appeared. I must produce a certificate stating I had been inoculated against the pest. What pest? I wanted to know. It was not mentioned in the long list of conditions to be complied with in flights to French West Africa that had been sent to me by the Air Ministry before my departure. Had I not complied with all these regulations and already shown the customs officer the mooring equipment, signal pistol complete with red and green rocket cartridges, the insurance policy for 100,000 francs to assist in paying for a search in the event of a forced landing on the lonely stretches over which I must fly to, is it pronounced Thies or Thies? I don't know, in Senegal.
Good question.
Okay. I'll say
figure that
Thies
out.
because I'm just not sure.
Yeah.
There were also the two big 2-gallon water containers, packets of emergency rations sufficient to last for 14 days, the 20% petrol margin, the glass tubes containing chemicals to indicate wind direction on impact with the ground, and of course, the heavy service revolver with 20 cartridges. I thought with a twinge of regret how these new regulations had already delayed the start of my flight for 1 month. Surely there could not be anything I had overlooked. So just to give you an idea of the extent of her tremendous preparation for this trip. And
Yeah.
then for a moment, they're just thinking, oh, it's all to waste because I'm missing this one thing. Long story short, she was able to continue. It was some kind of disease inland, and she wasn't going in that part of the country, so they allowed her to continue.
She was calling it plague.
Yeah.
Whatever that means. And it's teas, by the way. I Googled it while you were reading.
Thank you.
Teas.
Thank you. And it's in Senegal, the nation
Right.
that is now Senegal, which was a French colony. So in the next chapter, I enjoyed where she describes what it's like to monitor her course, look at the compass, make sure she's straight and level, holding the control stick, but also how to maneuver to get out her thermos. She's got a thermos of water, she's got a thermos of coffee, and how to unscrew the cap, pour the water, the coffee, and yet it's too hot. She has to let it cool. You know, how to peel and eat an orange. And I loved those details, and they come out here. She has an exciting time. Again, there were multiple mechanical issues, you know, in all these flights, as you can imagine. And she does describe one in this chapter called Sand and Sun, where she's attempting to land at T's, and the engine does not reduce power when the throttle is stuck. And she has to go around, comes around again for another approach and landing, happens again. So she has no choice. And this time, approaching T's, she cuts engine power. And this is it. It's a dead stick landing into T's, which she does do successfully. And then she has a shock. She had planned everything to fly into T's, which she thought was where the large aerodrome or airport was. Turns out everything had moved to Dakar, about 45 miles, actually closer to the coast.
Right.
Which also upsets her because if she'd known that, she would have been in Dakar and 45 minutes closer to Brazil.
Exactly.
And so she's very upset. But of course, now she's upset because she's trying to set a record from England to South America. The clock is running, and here she is. She's landed. It's darkness is falling or has fallen, and her fuel is not here. Her supplies are not here. And so she demands that they be brought to her from Dakar, and they do. During the night, they, by truck, bring all of her fuel and everything. And here's also the first time that I recall in the book, she describes then how she prepares her aircraft for this tremendously risky flight over a tremendous expanse of ocean, tearing down, dismantling parts of the engine, cleaning filters, checking magnetos, double checking oil, everything that she does. She does this hands-on with the people there helping her.
I have a question. Going back to this, realizing, okay, the situation on scene is not what I expected to be. Everybody told me I should come to T's. All my crap has been moved to Dakar. Was anyone else like, hey, just get back in the plane and go fly to Dakar? Like, I was like, why don't we just
because
call
it was
an audible
nighttime.
here?
I'm sorry, I left that out. It was nighttime, and they did not have night takeoff and landing.
There we go. Okay,
facilities. So
good reason. Okay.
Yeah. But good question. That's a good question.
I was like, just get closer.
Yeah. And then at the towards the end of this chapter, so she's supervising the fueling. She's already supervised checking the engine and everything. So she's finishing preparing her her aircraft for this overwater flight, and she realizes she has to lighten the load, and so she just starts jettisoning everything that she can, the guns, a lot of what we would call safety equipment. She just throws it aside. She keeps 2 evening dresses because she says, Well, first of all, they're very light. They weigh practically nothing. And if I make it there, I'm going to need these. And if I
Right.
don't make it, well, it wouldn't have made any difference anyway.
That's
I
right.
mean, that kind of attitude, it's like, okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, so she throws away the guns because that was a consideration she mentioned earlier, that they're not allowed to bring guns into South America. So yeah, she takes it all out. It's just dead weight.
Mm-hmm.
And in chapter 11, then she talks about flying across the Atlantic. And this is just tremendous. In worldwide flying, air operations, there are some parts of the world that, and also for sailors, parts of the world where the oceans are incredibly dangerous all the time. And around the world, there for air travel, likewise, there are places where the weather is terrible all the time. And the South Atlantic, in what's called the South American Convergence Zone, it is due to world weather patterns where in the book they're referred to as depressions. They're in American parlance. When we talk about weather language, we use the term a low, which means a pressure low, and low pressure means bad weather, low clouds, but also storms. Well, in the South American Convergence Zone, it is known for tremendously powerful thunderstorms that go on for miles and miles and miles. And she takes off from Tees and is aiming for a spot in Brazil. She happens to see a ship, and she departs still before dawn and sees a ship off the coast. And then later she sees a ship that tells her she's getting close to Brazil. But in between, a description of the challenge of hour after hour flying blind in driving rain and thunderstorms. It's just, I mean, like I say, it would be terrifying.
And just trying to maintain course and
Yes.
knowing that just the tiniest error
Yes.
is going to set you, you're going to land in a wildly different place than you expected to.
Exactly.
Over those distances.
When she described checking drift on her course by looking at the wave caps,
which is ridiculous, by the way.
yeah,
Well, it is a technique, but yeah, it's a
I
whack.
I spent my whole life flying over the water and on the water. It's really not that reliable to do it that way. It's just not.
Well,
that was one of those where it's like what they knew at the time.
Yeah.
And
it's not a landmark. It's not sitting still.
No,
there are no landmarks.
Exactly.
In that ocean. Yeah. Yep. And she starts doing the mental math of calculating, well, if I'm off course in this direction, I will see this, this, and this, and this. And if I'm off course in this direction, you know, I think I'll see this and this and this, and I can land here. You know, so she, just like a pilot does, she's already planning contingencies. Well, after flying blind in heavy rain for 13 hours and almost 2,000 miles of ocean, she makes landfall 1/2 mile from her original aiming point.
Yeah.
A half mile off course. Amazing.
It is.
So
stunning.
We need to emphasize this woman's skill as a pilot.
Yeah. No GPS.
Nothing.
And her description of the doldrums. Yes. And her grandparents coming over in a yacht, getting stuck in the doldrums.
That's right.
And what happened with her compass.
Yeah. Right. It swings.
Where her compass swing like 180 degrees off, and she's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like, what
the
fuck?
Yeah.
Although she didn't use that language, but like, yeah. Tremendous. When she landed in Brazil, her time from England to South America was 61 hours, 15 minutes, reducing the record, setting a new record, lowering the time by almost a whole day from the prior record holder, who was James Mollison. James Mollison, by the way, was at one time the husband of Amy
Amy
Johnson.
Johnson.
Yeah. So set a record. In chapters 12 and 13, I won't spend a lot of time on them, but she had landed in Brazil in the northern part of the nation. It is a very large nation. It is the fourth largest nation in the world by land area. So it's quite large. So she does talk about her long flight to Rio de Janeiro, which is in the southern part of the country. She meets the president, gifts, gems, jewelry, awards. She flies on to Buenos Aires, huge crush of people, meets the Argentine president at the Casa Rosada, goes to Montevideo. She's met by the daughter of the president. Many, many banquets, receptions, Aero Club talks, press talks, awards, honors, achievements. I mean, it goes on and on. And I won't go into it, but it's in the book in great detail. And she returns to England with her airplane by boat. And that brings us to chapter 14.
Yeah, so in chapter 14, she gets an invitation to go to Paris. And she meets Louis Blériot. How do we say his name? Everybody help me out.
Blériot.
Blériot. So he's an inventor. If anybody who is an av geek probably knows all this already, but he was an inventor who advanced aviation designs, including producing the first successful monoplane. And he was the first to fly across the English Channel. So he presents her with a couple of stamps commemorating that and a signed copy. And so for me, just thinking, we are looking back at her as this gem of history, but she recognizes in his presence that she is in the presence of greatness, and she is privileged to meet him and accepts this lovely gift. And later that year he passes on, so she just had this really special moment of being able to meet this historic aviator.
And this is just an additional example of the people she's met in aviation who were absolute pioneers in aviation, and she overlapped with them and met them and honors, recognizes their contributions. So it's an important thing in the book.
Yeah, this book is a who's who of aviation history. It's really great for me. I always talk about how reading these books helps me it gives me a portal into our history that I connect with more readily than I do when I read, men's history. So it just helps me absorb all of that information in a more accessible way. So that was wonderful. And it makes me, like Jackie pointed out before, it makes me want to jump off and go read more, about all of these people that she drops all these names, and I want to go read about them some more. So it's great. She goes in the next chapter, she goes on a flying tour. So in her trip from London to South America, she talks about flying over Spain and looking down at it and thinking, oh, it looks lovely, but she doesn't land there. She's in this monoplane now that has the legs to get over the country, so she doesn't stop there. So she goes back in this chapter with her mom, like on a flying tour. And at some point, placing us in the context of history, she leaves mom. She is the first air woman, as she calls herself, the first British airwoman to be selected for the Legion of Honor in France. And so she's informed of this in that trip to Paris, but it's got to go through its approval. So she gets invited back. She leaves mom in Spain. She's like, goes off to receive this award. And when she's there, the Spanish Civil War starts to break out. And she's like, Mom, get to Barcelona. I'm going to come pick you up and get you out of there. So she does that. So I thought that was just an interesting little, snapshot of where we were in history. And so on to the next section of the book, we're talking about, what she is most famous for, I think, is her solo flight to New Zealand. And Jackie, I'll let you take that away.
This one, having flown with her in the book, with the first flight in the open cockpit biplane, here now we are making basically the same flight to Australia, but now she's in a different airplane, much more upgraded for her for the time. And so there's just a little bit of a different attitude and approach, even though she is totally aware of the amount of bad weather that she could and will encounter. It's still just absolutely a fascinating approach to the whole thing. This is the trip where she talked about having the chit that she had to buy for fuel, and never talked about those sorts of things before, except when she was going to South America, when she didn't have the fuel where she needed it. But all that preparation that went into it, this was one of the first times she talked specifically about how that was handled. And the Shell representative happened to be on the field. And so he took care of the fact that she could buy fuel on credit and not have to spend pounds sterling. It was another one of those things that brought back the flight planning that she never really talked about. It was fascinating. But the storms again, and I think when we think of a monoplane, we don't think that it's a fabric covered monoplane. It's not metal. And so when she got into the storm that was so bad, it was beating off the dope on the leading edge of her airplane. It made me stop and, kind of reconsider. I have no idea what she did, but that's stunning.
Yeah.
And then when she landed, God love duct tape,
Right.
it was, it was something else, but basically they
Yeah.
taped the holes in the wings together.
Yeah. Incredible.
It was those sorts of things. Even with an upgraded airplane, the experience that she had, that trip from London to Australia still held some of the most fantastic experiences I've ever read. And so it may have been there, done that, but not really. It was an interesting chapter in that when she reached Australia, people were so excited for her. Crowds were everywhere she landed, but always in the back of her mind, the trip was not finished.
Right.
Yes, it was a huge accomplishment, but the trip was not finished.
Well, she set a record to Australia because she made it right from London to Sydney in a record 8 days.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
And so
So
they're
she
like,
already set a record.
yeah.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, you did it. And she's like, wait, I'm not done yet.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the amount of pressure that she faced with the people in Australia who, why do you need to do the next leg? Because the Tasman Sea is an interesting experience, putting it mildly. The weather, and I think we all forget that it's quite a distance. It's not just a channel between the islands. And so why do you need to do this?
Mhm.
Why don't you just rest on your laurels and be happy with what you've accomplished? And it goes back to what we've all said about why it is she does what she does. But that personality, that no, this is what I planned. And several times about the leg from Australia to New Zealand proved to her that it would prove to everyone else how valuable air travel would be
Yes.
in
Right.
connecting everything. So it just it,
That's something that I don't think we've talked enough about, to be honest, because she doesn't really talk about it as much until we get to this part of
Right.
like her
right,
mindset. She's getting all this pressure. Half the country thinks they have a say in her decisions and, is against her flying to New Zealand. And she's like, no, I'm going to do this. Not only is it my personal goal, I'm not going to quit now, even though that would be the easy thing and just take all the accolades for what I've already accomplished. I want to do this. But the reason I want to do this is because I want to demonstrate, that aviation is going to connect all of us. And I dream of a day where there is a fast, flight from London to New Zealand, and I want to open that door.
Yeah,
right,
and I think this is important to emphasize because she says specifically, this is part of the British Empire, or the greater United Kingdom, and this is a connection to connect New Zealand, to
Yeah.
all of to Britain. But I also want to put it in context of this was a large part of what was behind Charles Lindbergh's later flights after he made his record-breaking flight across the Atlantic and became a worldwide hero and star. He made many pioneering flights with his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh to set air routes to prove that this could be possible, that there could be regular air service, whether it's for airmail and for passengers, and to connect different parts of the world. And Amelia Earhart, a lot of her promotion, when you read her actual speeches and her
Hmm.
articles that she wrote, it was always about promoting air service, that it connects us to each other
right.
and brings us all closer in time and distance. And that is absolutely what Jean Batten is saying here.
She
And
was
I want to
such a forward thinker that way.
both. Yeah, and you know what? As you're saying this, I'm starting. As I go through these books, different aspects of history kind of start to connect for me. And as you're saying this, I'm starting to appreciate the the culture of the aviation culture of the time, and thinking about, like, there a lot of the people that I'm surrounded by are connected because our goal is to help promote women in aviation. And so when just thinking about this atmosphere of the pilots who were doing these, who were setting these records, flying these races, there was an air of competition, but this common goal of wanting to, further aviation and make it more accessible around the world. And that is just an epiphany that I'm having in the moment.
Right. And, you know, throughout the whole book, not once had she said anything about feeling lesser than or competing with until this flight, because
Hmm.
she says, then too there was the fact that I was a woman flying alone, and Australia, like New Zealand, is very much a man's country.
Hmm.
First time
Yeah.
that, and I could
Or
be
only
wrong
time.
about the book,
Only time.
but
Nope.
No,
only
you're
The only time.
only time. And so I think that must have been unbelievable pressure, and everybody had an opinion.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
being able to go, nope, gonna do it anyway. And so when she finally did, the the little part in the last part of 17, where the fellow offered her a life vest.
All right.
And I thought, oh, geez, with all she's done, and here is this little guy offering her life vest. And she said, well, I couldn't get out of the airplane with it. And he went, don't inflate it all the way.
Right.
It kind of was this light point, but her celebrity, people really cared about her, cared about who she was as a person, cared about who she was as a countryman. And so it was, I thought, that's hysterical. But the crossing of the sea, it was, and I don't remember what the distance is. Do either of you have
1,300
that?
miles. Yeah,
So
1,300 miles.
Okay. So, it's not going to be an easy flight. It's known for the bad weather. And she had the fortitude to stick with it. I wondered how much the Atlantic crossing and the mindset she had with that during some of those situations affected the attitude she had with crossing the Tasman Sea. But when she finally got to New Zealand, she could have landed at New Plymouth, but chose not to, which I think says a lot about her and the fortitude that she had. When she and I kept having to tell myself, this is her home country. And yet there was so much that she hadn't experienced in her home country, which kind of caught me off guard. And once again, when she got there, we're talking parties and receptions and gifts, and her attention to detail is hysterical. It was an enjoyable look at where she'd been, forging new territory, and where she was.
There was one little sentence. I always make a note. People who listen to my interviews with authors, I talk about this a lot, about where a reader cries in a book, and it's not typically like when the main character is struggling or anything. It's when the main character gets what they need. And so I felt the prick of tears on page 158 to 159 when she was flying over that island that you mentioned where she could have landed, and she continues on. She says, my altitude was less than 500 feet as I flew over the town, and I could see the people running into the streets waving a welcome. And like, I get the tears now. Like, she did it. This whole book builds to this moment where she successfully completes this solo flight to New Zealand. And even though that's not the finish line that she's looking for, but it is. She did it. I got emotional, even though she doesn't convey a whole lot of emotion in the book. I got emotional on her behalf.
Well, I'd like to read a very, very small portion from the book that talks about her personality, and this is central to the book. It's when she does see New Plymouth, and she says, why not be content and land? After all, I was terribly tired, and it would take tremendous effort to continue on to Auckland. No, I thought quickly, remembering my intention before leaving England.
Yeah.
Yeah.
to make the first direct flight right through to Auckland. Opening up the throttle, I flew on towards that city 154 weary miles farther north.
Right.
154 weary miles.
Yeah.
But you
And
can
she got right.
tell that she thought about it,
Oh yeah.
because when it was, so I opened up the throttle and went on, and you think, okay, it did make an impression, but we don't know what kind of an impression it was.
No, I was expecting for the next chapter to be reflections on her experience. But what do we get in the next chapter? Parties and awards.
Parties, yeah,
Parties and awards.
yeah.
Make note. Make note.
Did you guys have anything else to say? I know I have, but I
just wanted to say this achievement won her second Herman Trophy.
That's right. That's right.
Her
Yep.
wasn't it her? She shared one with
Amelia.
She previously shared one with Amelia Earhart. This time she won it herself for
Right.
this flight.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, one of the quotes from the book, and so I'm ready to hear, Jenny, what you have to say about this biography about her, because I'm dying to know more about her. But I just want to. This quote is on page 162, and it is actually from Maggie Shipstead. I can't read it in the pictures that I see of the statue of Jean Batten in New Zealand, but according to Maggie, it was this quote on the bottom of the statue that says, that is the end of this quote. She was like, because she starts talking about how after this accomplishment, all of her friends are pressuring her to settle down. Can't you just be done now? Like, you've tempted fate enough. Like, but she says, I wanted very much to settle down in my own country and lead a calm, peaceful life. But in my heart, I knew only too well that I was destined to be a wanderer. And Maggie opens her book, Great Circle, with a twist on that quote, but it's inspired by that.
Yes. And, I think she knew herself when at the opening, when she said, when I was 2, I was going to Rome.
That's right.
It's who she is. And aside from the comment about the fiance, she was very comfortable with that aspect of who she was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Jenny Dish.
Okay. Well, no, we've got more of the book to go through.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm so
We're
excited
not
about
there yet. I mean, I can talk fast.
She's not back in London yet.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot. I'm rushing us along. I'm so
were
excited
rushing
about
us
I want
along.
gossip about her. That's right. Like, okay, that was another thing. After the New Zealand flight, I was like, okay, good. Now we can get to the reflections. And I was just saying that, it's the wars. Oh no, we got to fly back to London again. And yeah, you take that one. Sorry, everybody.
That's okay. So chapter 19 is called Australia, and she talks about spending time in Australia with her mother. And she talks about a plane that goes down with 2 pilots and 7 passengers, where the pilot was a great friend of hers. And she has her plane, which was shipped over from New Zealand to Australia. She has it quickly assembled to help with the air search. Ultimately, the flight is found. There were 2 survivors, but not the pilots. And that was interesting because it was one of the first times in the book where there appeared to be a glimmer of but human warmth and caring for others. And then she begins preparation for her flight back to England in her own airplane. And she talks about her fitness routine. She had made reference to it earlier, where before setting out on one of her flights when she was in England with her mother, they did a walking tour of England, walked 80 miles. And it wasn't just to see England and go walking, although that seemed to be part of it, and to be with her mother. But it was also like, this is my fitness routine. Well, here she mentions that her fitness routine for the flight to England include skipping, running, swimming, walking, and horse riding. And I do think this is important to touch upon because these are endurance flights.
Yeah.
These are incredible feats of physical endurance.
Yep.
And in addition to, of course, mental endurance and fortitude.
Focus. Yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
That's great.
She sets off and lands in this incredible dust storm in part of the outback of Australia called Carmouille. I may be mispronouncing that. She goes to Darwin. Again, this is just crossing the whole Australian continent. She lands in Darwin and describes in great detail a dance of Aboriginal people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's part of the round of receptions, talks, meetings with VIPs. Then she continues her flight to England. And this is actually the launching point because, again, she's trying to set a record of time from Australia back to England. So now, and this is beginning from Darwin, where now she's got a time clock going for her. By the way, and she did mention that a couple times in the book, she always had 2 clocks in her aircraft.
Yes.
One was set to Greenwich Mean Time and the other set to the local time of where she was. And she talks about how the time changes and how the hours of the day is different as she goes east and west. So just an interesting little pilot aside. Well, I have a quick aside about that because I've flown long international flights. And I remember distinctly one flight where we have augmented crew. So we aren't actually physically in the cockpit flying for 12 or 14 hours. We have additional pilot crew members and we trade in and out, resting and flying. And anyway, so on this flight, we're returning from Tokyo, Japan to Chicago. We're out over the North Pacific. It's blackness above, blackness below, no horizon, no nothing to illuminate anything. And I'm back in the cockpit with one other pilot and sitting there, and we're flying eastbound. And there's this gray appears on the horizon. And pilots who've flown quite a bit know that the gray is like can be a pre-dawn. The dawn doesn't begin with a nice, pretty pink or orange color. It actually begins with this gray. But we were near the international date line. I looked at the other pilot and I said, I don't know exactly what day it is where we are, what time it is right here where we are, and I don't know if it's the sun or the moon coming over that horizon. That's how discombobulating it can be.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
And so anyway, she had the 2 clocks. So a quick aside. So she launches her flight, and she kind of doesn't go into a lot of detail about how all the problems she has on this return trip, except in some summarizing statements. Terrible storms, again. St. Elmo's fire on the propeller.
Yep.
Torrential rains.
Yes.
She sees a water spout. A water spout, in meteorological terms, is a tornado. Tornadoes are on land. A water spout is the same phenomenon over water, and it draws water up into it. 2 different times she met with such terrible weather, she did a 180 and went back to the last airport or city during this trip.
Yep.
And that, by the way, I need to point out, is a hallmark of a good pilot. When you don't push on, when you reach the point of the prudent thing is to go back. She did it twice on this return trip. And she is, because she's going now from east to west, she is encountering a lot more headwinds. So it's just more challenging with the distance and in addition to the geography and all of the weather. And she herself is quoted as saying, it was infinitely more difficult to fly from Australia to England than in the opposite direction. She still set records. She flew over 2,000 miles from Rangoon to Karachi. She flew part of her flights at 500 feet above the ground to avoid headwinds. She flew through incredible heat. The soles of her shoes became stuck to the rudder pedals.
She's the first solo pilot to make the flight from Rangoon to Karachi in a single day. She sometimes rested for only 4 hours before continuing on this trip. Again, these are incredible feats of physical endurance. On one flight, she was scheduled to end up in Rome, but the weather was such she turned back, landed in Naples, and she was so exhausted that she had to be bodily lifted out of the cockpit and given stimulants. Anyway, she did it in 5 days, 18 hours, and 15 minutes, lowering the solo record for that flight from Australia to England, lowering it by 14 hours. And I'm going to end with a very small quote that when she landed in Croydon, my mother, who had always been my inspiration and the guiding light of my whole life, would be there to welcome me and probably a few friends. Well, it turned out to be a giant crowd. Over 10,000 people greeted her there. And that summarizes what was her last record-breaking flight.
Reflecting on some of the decisions that she made on this flight in contrast to the way that she pressed on in the other flights,
Right.
and also thinking about the context of the times and the risks that people were taking, I understand and I see in hindsight and looking at our history how beneficial all of the buzz was around, record setting races, those kinds of things. But also, like, it was freaking dangerous. And, yes, she was a skilled pilot and yes, she was successful, but there were so many times where there was an element of fortune in her favor.
Oh, yeah.
Plenty of times she could have bid it on any one of these flights.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, when she finally was deciding to turn around on this, I was like, well, finally, like,
Yeah.
I would have landed a while ago, but okay. Yeah.
And I do want to read one quote from a prior chapter where she speaks to that, really for one of the first times. And it's actually before she embarks on her flight from Australia to New Zealand. So the incredibly difficult 1,300-mile trip that Jackie spoke about earlier. And what had happened was she was interviewed by a radio for radio. And then she goes and starts her engine. And then the guy runs up and goes, oh, I forgot to press record.
Yeah.
And she's like, she shuts down the engine to give him the quote again before leaving, which was a big deal to her that she did that, that she delayed her departure for this. But there's a quote here that I wanted to read that she says. She goes, I want to speak to the group captain. And I think that means someone in the military service. I'm sorry, I'm not real clear what that title means.
Yeah.
But I shouted above the roar of the engine, and a reporter quickly wrote down my message as he hurried forward. If I go down in the sea, no one must fly out to look for me. I have chosen to make this flight, and I'm confident I can make it, but I have no wish to imperil the lives of others or cause trouble or expense to my country. Well, goodbye, I shouted, smiling reassuringly at the sea of tense white faces. I'll come back one day.
Yeah.
So that was her attitude.
Yeah.
At least as she put in print. And I believe it because everything points to that being authentic for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Are you going to talk about chapter 21? Because there is the quote at the very end of that chapter that I'd also like to read or something.
Bring it. Yeah. Like if you, so like I said earlier, we get to chapter 21. I was just excited to get on to the gossip that you're going to share with us, Jenny. That's why I was rushing us through, but that was really an important, aspect of the story was that last flight. Sorry, got excited, but yeah. Chapter 21 though was for me a little deflating. I was kind of like, okay, you had a lot of parties, but you said you have something from the chapter that you want to share.
Yeah. She first gives a very long list of all the nations and places she's visited around the world, exotic places, which is tremendous. But then she gets to this in the same paragraph. There have been times when vital decisions had to be made
in the fraction of a second, decisions that meant life or death, and depended on a clear brain working in perfect coordination with a steady hand. There have been other times when the loneliness has been so intense that I've longed for the sound of a human voice, or the sight of a ship, or even a tiny native village to dispel the feeling of complete isolation that one feels when flying alone over the sparsely inhabited tracts that comprise such a great area of the Earth's surface. Every flyer who ventures across oceans to distant lands is a potential explorer. In his or her breast burns the same fire that urged the adventurers of old to set forth in their sailing ships for foreign lands. Riding through the air on silver wings instead of sailing the seas with white wings, he must steer his own course, for the air is uncharted, and he must therefore explore for himself the strange eddies and currents of the ever-changing sky in its many moods.
That last paragraph, that
Yeah.
that helped. And Liz, I agree. I got real tired of the parties and the dresses after a while.
But to her credit,
Yeah,
but to her
that
credit.
last paragraph
Yeah.
kind of saved some of that and brought me back to where she really was forward thinking
Yeah.
and not selfish in a lot of ways, but yet selfish enough to be targeted on her goals.
Yeah. No, that's true.
So everything that follow, so that's the end of this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So everything we talk about from here on out is not in that book. Just to let you know. And it actually comes from this book. Okay.
Jean Batten, The Garbo of the Skies.
Right. Written by Ian McCursky, came out in 1990. And it is a very, very detailed biography where he did literally a ton of footwork, literally walking and looking for records and files and meeting people who knew her and interviewing them at length. So this is a very, very heavily researched biography to find out more about this person who basically disappears from the aviation scene after this book comes out. I want to draw attention again to the title of this book, Alone. Alone in the Sky. Okay. So I'll summarize what this author says. It's not a very pretty picture about Jean Batten. 1938 is when that book was produced. Well, what was happening, right? World War II. And she was a little bit older by this time. I think she was around, she was born in 1909. Okay. And so she applied for the Air Transport Auxiliary. Jackie, did you want to talk about that for a moment?
The ATA?
Or anything you know about her and the ATA? Because she was not in the ATA.
I don't know much about that. I know when I met Lettuce Curtis and we were talking about Amy Johnson and that group, she briefly mentioned Jean Batten, but not anything specific. And I just got, and with Lettuce, you knew when it was time not to go any further than you had already gone. And so I don't really, Lettuce was the one who told me it was so unfortunate that I didn't have any time in a Spitfire. But so I don't have any background on that. I knew she wanted to, but she didn't.
So just to summarize very briefly, the Air Transport Auxiliary was an auxiliary to the Royal Air Force of Britain. And the members of the ATA, if they were men, they didn't physically qualify either from age or some infirmity or, whether it was eyesight or some other issue physically that they couldn't qualify. So they were accepted into the ATA if they were pilots, and they accepted women. And so Pauline Gower handpicked at first, and then there were British women first, then later, as we're going to talk more about the ATA, I'm sure, later in the series,
of course,
in
yeah.
depth. But women from other parts of the world also joined the ATA, including from the United States and Canada, but also New Zealand, South Africa, other nations. But in the beginning, it was a pretty small group. It was about 8 or 9 women who Pauline Gower organized. And notable, the absence was notable of the absence of Jean Batten, who with 2,600 hours and her incredible pilot experience, having flown these flights, was more experienced than any of those other women at that time.
Of course, yeah.
She applied, apparently. So this is what it's very sketchy, but apparently Jean Batten applied. She was not. She was turned down. She uses an excuse about eyesight, but then this author goes into, well, there were others who were allowed into the ATA with eyesight issues. If she had just pursued it farther, she would have. And he speculates, again, alone, he speculates that she didn't like competing. She wasn't in community with other women. She didn't like competing with other women. She didn't like being compared to them. She held herself above all of them. I think that she felt it was an incredible insult that she wasn't immediately accepted and then adored and honored. So she was not in the ATA. Britain took her airplane. They paid her for it, but they took it and put it into service. Britain put everything into service for World War II.
Yeah.
What I was gonna mention in Kathy Mexted's book, the Australian women pilots book, she kind of does one woman from each decade, and one of the women she does is one who, it was an Australian woman who did actually go. She went to the UK to England because her husband was a service officer and she was a pilot, and so she was able to fly for the ATA. But yeah, like even their civil aviation, like no women were flying in Australia at the time either. So yeah, that's just context.
But Jean Batten didn't fly again. Apparently, her airplane was taken. She, according to this book, she did join the ambulance service for a short time, but then figured out that ambulance drivers on the continent were being killed. She came back to Britain and did a lot of publicity, wearing a nice uniform and being a public face of raising funds for the war. And he just speculates she was just too much of a loner. She too much loved the adoration. Think back to the book and all the receptions and honors and awards and meeting presidents and medals and trophies. And she loved that. And she didn't want to be tested. She didn't want to compete with the other women and come up short. That apparently it was notable that she'd avoided all air competitions and races with women.
Wow. And
she grew. There's more.
Part of the ATA experience was being exactly that, a part of.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I can understand.
Mm-hmm. And then after the war, she became very close to her mother. We don't get a full picture in her own book, but it's clear in this book. She had a brother, and of course her father, not close at all with either one of them, like at all, like estranged for decades. And but very close to her mother. And when I say very close to her mother, it was like many people commented that it was like abnormally close to her mother. Like some people likened it to a marriage that close to her mother. And they sold everything after the World War II, moved to Jamaica, lived there for 6 years, moved back to England, went on a 7-year car trip through Europe, laughing, living it up, living out of a car and suitcase. They gravitated south. They lived on the Costa del Sol, Spain for 6 years, ended up in Tenerife. Her mother died there. Her mother was over 90. Jean had no friends, but stayed alone there 16 years. And then in 1977, she was honored in New Zealand. She is to this day honored in New Zealand, again, for very good reason. I mean, when you go to New Zealand and you're in aviation, you will definitely hear a lot about Jean Batten. So she kind of rallied. She spent 2 years reworking her original memoir that was
My Life.
Yeah, My Life, reworking this memoir to make it into this memoir that was the one we've just reviewed, which was published in 1979. So she lived with and worked with the publisher and his family for 2 years. So this author interviewed them at length, and there's just a lot of really
Wow.
quirky stuff about her and really kind of repellent. Of this she appeared to be a person who really just couldn't be a friend to other people.
Just couldn't function in human relationships.
No.
Well, I know some people like that.
Yeah, and he does allude to, there were rumors that she did have a couple of affairs with a couple of men, but they were short-lived, and then invariably, like, she and her mother then immediately moved to a completely different country. So no lasting relationships whatsoever, except with her mother.
Wow.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And in 1985, I think it was when this author got really interested in her and like, well, where is Jean Batten? And it took several years to track it down because she had family members still in New Zealand. She had her brother's family and his children, so she had nieces and nephews. They had no idea where she was. And what he found finally is she had ended up in Mallorca, lived in isolation and obscurity, died and was buried in a pauper's grave. And it was not discovered, not even her own family knew, until he uncovered it 5 years after her death.
Wow.
Yeah. So pretty sad ending. But when I hear all that and then look back at this book that we just reviewed,
right,
some of the signs are there. Because what I talked about being absent from her memoir is human connections.
Yeah, warm. But this is very fascinating because we're going to see this again and again and again in these women's memoirs.
But there are others who weren't that way. I mean, the beautiful.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
No, of course.
But you're right. We will see more like that.
Yeah. Yep. It's really interesting.
It is. Yeah.
All of this will come together.
And one last little thought about her, because it's something that's important to me, is that when I do what I do, whether it's an achievement as a pilot or as a person, I'm trying to lift up other women. I try to lift up other women pilots.
Of course.
Yeah, you say of course. She didn't really do that.
No. And also, of course, like if you look at our community even today, we have an interesting combination of personalities that
some are in it for themselves.
Yeah.
So, someone used the word selfishness earlier on, and that comes to mind with her here.
Selfish, self-centered, but
yet she achieved all these things, which are amazing.
But
she really was exceptional.
But then you look at the achievements, and would she have achieved them if she would have been the kind that was reaching out instead of being focused like this?
That's a fair question. I think that is a fair question.
Yeah.
Well, and a fair question to anyone who marries and has children. These are, I don't have children. Yeah. These are things that distract you from other ambitions and goals that you might have in life. It's a fact.
It's choices, and it was. Yeah.
Doesn't mean that you can't achieve your goals, or some of them anyway. I'm just here to say, I'm always like trying to combat that sort of blanket attitude of you can't do it and have children while you can, there are just some compromises you have to make.
Exactly. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying you can't do it all,
Yeah.
because she could have, after the war, she could have married,
Yeah.
even if she was older. I don't know about the children part, but she could have married and had a beautiful family life.
Yeah.
She
But that
didn't.
just wasn't her jam, and we respect that, and that's okay. And it's okay if that,
Yeah.
you know,
She's just different.
the end of her life. I mean, I kind of feel like people reap what they sow, and if you are someone who is a loner, then you'll probably,
Yeah.
be
She
alone.
had a lot of trophies.
She had a lot of trophies, and all of the respect to her for all of that she accomplished
Absolutely.
for women, for aviation, for New Zealand. Lots of national pride there. So
No question.
yep, not
What
taking any of that
an
away.
exceptional
Yeah.
pilot.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I ain't casting shade on any dead ladies, except
No.
for maybe a couple of them that we'll get to later, one or two.
Well, she didn't do anything. She didn't do harm. I mean,
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll talk about those other ladies later. We'll get to them. Okay, listen, y'all. This time last year, I was pitching the idea to do a conversation like this to Jacque Boyd. And Jacque said, "Oh, let's bring Jenny in." And I was like, "Absolutely." And we did it. I think we hit 5 books this year. I'm so proud of us because we're all busy ladies. We're all involved. I'm going to run off here in a couple of hours and sit in on a 99s scholarship selection committee. Y'all are busy doing all of the wonderful work that you do in the community. And also, bring in listeners to this because of your own professional reputations that you've put out in the world. I appreciate you. This is going to be our last one for this year. I don't think we need to, we're not going to decide today what book we're going to do starting next year, but we are going to continue this.
Yeah.
And we'll be back in the new year. And I just want to wish you, well, first of all, give you my gratitude, my thanksgiving to both of you for being a part of this, for your tutelage. I feel like I am learning from the masters with you too. It's a privilege for me. So thank you. And I wish everybody happy holidays and happy new year. And do you have anything that you want to offer to close us out?
You opened up a door that I needed to walk through. And you have no idea how appreciative I am of that. This has just been beyond fun. So thank you.
It's a lot of hard work, and I appreciate your dedication to it. I really do.
Yeah. And Liz, I am just, the honor is mine to sit at a table with the two of you, or sit at a microphone with the two of you. It is, I just in awe of the knowledge and history that you bring, and your caring and your insights. I learn so much myself by participating here. So I am just pleased and honored to be here. So thank you for including me. And I look forward to many more books, reviews. This is a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun. We will see you next year.